continuing our exploration of lights and rendering, I generated some new forms here that at first, because we're rendering in Arnold, I want to apply an Arnold shader to these forms. So I'm going to apply a different standard surface shader to each of these and then make some adjustments to them. And I would really recommend for this project, since we're rendering in Arnold, that you'll use the Arnold shader. There are also Arnold lights, but we can pair those with Maya lights as well. But some of these Maya shaders, they just won't, Arnold won't render them. It will render its own shader much better than it renders some of these more primitive Maya shaders. So for this project, since we're not going to be importing this into a game engine or anything like that, let's use this Arnold shader. So I'm just going to go ahead and maybe adjust the color for these. Perhaps I'll make a kind of rainbow. And I can choose my values here in this slider. Or I have these swatches. Okay, and now I can also adjust things like, let's make some of these more metal. Maybe I'll adjust this to have a metalness to it. Maybe I'll increase the metallic quality over some of these so we can really see some of these properties work. So we'll leave that without any metalness, and we'll start to increase the metalness till yellow is completely metallic. And then we'll start to maybe change some of these to be more, to have more transparency. So this one, maybe I'll make it completely transparent, and let's put that green color back with it. And then I will leave these to see what happens with them. But maybe this one I'll also make transparent. Turn the transmission weight all the way up. Perhaps for this one, I'll do the transmission weight will be 50%. Again, transmission being transparency. So I'm just adjusting, again, these different attributes here for my standard surface shaders to see what kind of effects I will get. Perhaps for this blue, I'll go down to emission and turn up the emission for it. Maybe I'll turn this to 50% and put its color to be dark, to be a blue, so it's kind of glowing blue. And maybe for this purple, I will turn the emission all the way up. And for black, we'll make this super matte black, and we'll turn the specularity completely down. Okay, so let's see what this looks like if I render it. Rather than diving back into some of these Maya lights right away, which I will go through all of them in a little bit, there are also some Arnold lights that we can find here under the Arnold tab. And Arnold and lights here. So I have, the first one I'm going to show you is Sky Dome light. And what Sky Dome light does is it applies a general kind of white circle dome of light to the entire scene. You can see it there, the Sky Dome light. And so what that will do is that will provide a really even lighting scheme to your objects. So now let's go to my renderer. And the other thing I want to show you before we go to my render view is that in order to preview what this will look like, of course I can hit 7, that will show you my lighting scheme. Although with this dome light around it, we have, it doesn't really anticipate what it will look like too clearly. But I also have what's called here these resolution gates, or these film gates If I go ahead and click this resolution gate, what this will do is it will provide me with a little window into the size of my render. Because the size of the viewport varies based on what tabs are open and whatnot, this shows you what our camera will look like when it's rendered. So I can really make some adjustments here. And so let's see what this will look like when I render it out. So let's go to my render view now, and it might take some time. And you can see down here in the help bar what percent of my image has been rendered. We're at about 5% or so. And so you see that sky dome light has really added like a very blinding overall lighting scheme that is completely shadowless kind of white environment that you can use as maybe a starter for your scenes, but I think adding more complicated lighting patterns to add shadows adds greater complexity. But this gives us an overall sense of our scene when I add this, this first sky dome light. But you can see that I don't necessarily have like reflections happening with my metallic, and I don't have any very much specular. I also don't have any transmission happening here. So while this lighting scheme gives us a kind of a really graphic look, it might not be the correct lighting that we want for our scene. So I'm going to go ahead and delete it, but I just wanted to show that to you. There are some other Arnold lights here. We have something that's cool as a mesh light, and the mesh light allows you to turn a mesh into a light. I can maybe turn one of my surfaces into a light, although I think this might only work with polymodeling, I'm not sure. Then I have things like physical sky. So these are some Arnold lights, but let's get back into our Maya lights for a minute. Let me give a direction light here. And let's see what this looks like just with that direction light placed into the scene. And so now I have a black background. The background is something that I can talk about it and we can adjust the color of it. And so I did want to mention that while in the previous video, I said that the scene looked really dark, and it's because we have to make adjustments for the Maya lights. I think in Maya 2022, they've adopted those adjustments already so that we don't have to make those adjustments. The reason that scene was so dark was because it was so large. So I've created a scene that has a smaller scale so that the lights themselves interact better. But because it was such a large scene, I would still have to maybe adjust for the intensity of the lights, but it was not because I have to do that because it's Arnold. They've placed that as part of this update to the software. Okay, so here you can see how those different materials are interacting with the light. I have my transparency and some of my glow. The glow from this blue is maybe affecting here this particular shape. So I really like the way this looks, even just with the one directional light. I have some shadows back here. I'm going to go ahead and close this render view for a second. Some of the other lights that we have available to us are point light. And when I add a point light in the scene, this adds kind of like a bare light bulb. Right, not necessarily in the, there's not an object here that's a bare light bulb, but we do have it gives off light over a particular distance and has a fall off value. If I go to my attribute editor, there are different attributes for these lights. So for the point light here, there's all sorts of different things we can get into. Shadow color, the intensity of it. and etc. So let's go ahead and render this and see what maybe with this point light, or let's render it with the point light. Let's see if we can really get that specular in there. Let's see what this looks like. I did change the position of the camera, so these renders do take a while to process, as you can tell. I'm going to jump ahead in the video. So it's really hard to tell. This took over 3 minutes to render. It's really hard to tell whether or not that you can't really see the point light here. There are a couple of things that we can do. The first thing is I can change the render. I can do a test resolution, and this will not render at the full settings. It will render maybe half the settings. So that's something I can turn on so that this will render faster, because I don't necessarily need to be previewing it at the full resolution. You just want to remember to turn that resolution maybe back to render settings before you go ahead and save your images. The other thing I can do, and I'm noticing that there are some harsh shadows, so I'm going to adjust the shadows in a little bit. The other thing I can do is use Arnold's renderer rather than the render view. So if I open up the Arnold render view, this gives us the possibility of rendering in a kind of real time, and this goes much faster. It takes a while to render, so we can see that actually some of the more transparent sections of this, or with the values that the materials that have more metallic are taking longer to render. But this will allow me to kind of preview our render. I'm going to zoom out here in real time while I'm making my lighting adjustments. So let me go ahead and maybe move my point light in the scenes, and you can start to see how that may be affecting our let me move it back. I had it in a nice position before. There we are. Now I can start to see it. And I might want to increase its intensity. So some of those Arnold render settings correlate to things like noise here that you're seeing, how to adjust for that. In this case, I kind of think some of this looks kind of nice and is glitchy in a way that is kind of appealing, but those are all your kind of aesthetic decisions to make. Let me increase the intensity of this light. Another type of light, the last type of light that I just want to show you today is the spotlight. The spotlight works like a spotlight you would expect it to, which is that it generates a kind of point light in a particular direction. So again, there's kind of fall off associated with it. Let me turn up the intensity of that spotlight. And this might be a type of light that I really need to, okay. So for this spotlight, what you can see is happening here is that this particular light does need to have its intensity adjusted quite a bit in order to be able to see it in Arnold. So I'm bumping this up to an intensity of 1,000, and now I'm really starting to see that spotlight have its effects. Here in the scene, you see it's incredibly bright, but in our Arnold renderer, it's not that bright, and it's only at an intensity, it's an intensity of 100 times, 1,000 times the original light source. The reason for that is because there's something called decay. Basically, for lighting in the general world, it falls off. The fall off for lights happens over a kind of exponential curve rather than a linear curve. And so this Arnold renderer really does render things kind of photorealistically. And so the lighting as well, the way that the lighting drops off also reflects a kind of cubic or three-dimensional drop-off. The other things there's something called drop off here, and this just deals with the kind of softness of the edge of the spotlight. It doesn't deal with the drop off that I'm talking about as far as the light falls away from its source. And then we have the cone's angle, so I can increase the size of the cone, etc. So those are some of the Maya lights that we can, or the Maya lights that we can work with in Arnold. And in the next video, we will get into adjusting some of these shadows.